Good morning, everybody. That tinkling you hear in the background is the wonderful Art Tatum. And if you want to hear some stuff you've never heard, possible stuff that challenges human convention, Art Tatum does things at times you're just like, what the F? Like, it's like, where did that come from? How do you have that nimble dexterity being 90% blind? I think it was totally blind in one eye, if I remember. Art's quite the character. This is from a Norgran compilation of sorts. Piano interpretations by Oscar Peterson, Art Tatum, Teddy Wilson, and Bud Powell. All four of them were pretty giant figures at this point. I mean, Oscar and his group with Herb Ellis and Ray Brown are backing most of the great verve sessions, clef sessions at that point. Tatum is a virtuoso of the highest level, and Norman Granz took it upon himself to record volumes of Art Tatum at the piano. Teddy Wilson, of course, comes from the Benny Goodman situation, which we're going to talk about that more in a second. And then the great Bud Powell. This is probably all 78 stuff, being there's 4 artists, each with a couple tracks. So I'm guessing it's from 78 era. Be standard reason. Why else would you couple them like that? Again, David Stone Martin album cover. I like some of Stone Martin's work. I'll admit I'm a bigger Burt Goldblatt fan, but I do like a lot of Stone Martin's work a lot. And I think Goldblatt's photography is just next level, as well as his graphic design and pencil drawings. But again, Stone Martin's fantastic as well. And they both create a mood. They both create a color that informs you about the music on some level. Anyway, cool Norgran piece. These old Norgrans are worth picking up when you see them. They are jazz royalty after all. Talking about Benny Goodman and Teddy Wilson. I was talking to my buddy Scott Baldwin yesterday, who is one of the great fonts of knowledge out there. You know, he's got a massive collection and has just incredible stuff. You know, and he has later era stuff than I do sometimes, with the 70s and 80s stuff from a lot of these artists. And so we love sounding off each other, and if one of us has a question or opinion, we find each other, I think, as sounding boards or a good place to questionnaire. You know, have you heard this? You know about that? Scott's quite the character, and humble. He doesn't really want to be online, or I've tried to get him to do a few things, and he's always been like, no thank you. But the guy really knows his stuff. But we were talking yesterday about something I've come to realize, filling in the Decca and Capitol and RCA stuff the last few months. And I've really bought probably 300 titles just to kind of fill those, and some Columbia stuff as well. And my Columbia stuff was already pretty well represented, but I probably added 50 things there, and probably added close to 100 of the others. Not 100, probably 60, 70 titles in Capitol. And same with Decca, probably 40, 50 titles, and RCA is probably in that same range. And I'll just try to fill out and round up what was actually jazz, as we remember it, knowing what was more the more saccharine pop side. It was pretty informative. For example, I discovered that this Decca is where a lot of Armstrong's current recordings were taking place, and a lot of what Columbia is putting up by Armstrong is Hot 5s, Hot 7s, vault stuff that Columbia is coming into the control of. And I've always had some Decca stuff, mostly the 9200 series with the George Russells and that kind of stuff. Less of the 8000, 4000 sequence main series. But I had filled in some Al Hibbler. I had filled in some Sammy Davis. I had filled in, some pieces, and I also had quite a bit of chorale stuff, which was Decca. But my chorale probably had more than my Decca did. So filling in Decca, I found a whole bunch of Armstrong stuff from the 50s, a whole bunch of Ella stuff from the 40s and 50s before Norman Granz's contract. And so, I'm like, that's where their current work was. And I already knew Ella at Norman, pretty well. And I've been filling in some of that stuff too. There's so much of it. It's incredible what that 4000 sequence has to offer. Beyond even the songbooks, there's some great titles. The Get Happy record was really fun. Listened to that yesterday. But so it's just fun seeing where some of these artists ended up in that era and what's considered their classic records. For example, Basie's Atomic Basie on Roulette. That album's always had a fairly high esteem, even though Basie was kind of falling somewhat into the old cat crowd a little bit. You know, the Atomic Mr. Basie's always been kind of a collectible piece that was reissued even going back into the probably early thousands. I remember seeing that on end caps being reissued. With Ellington, Blues in Orbit, something that's always kind of had a cachet to it. And a few other Ellington pieces as well have always had, I mean, even the Newport record, which was everywhere, resurgence for those guys. They always had a few records that were considered similar recordings from even those late eras. So while you want 39 to 41 Ellington, there's some great Ellington stuff from the 50s. And it takes a while to suss out what's what. The Liberian Suite comes from the 40s, but it was reissued several times in the 50s on Columbia, by Ellington. So it's a bit of a, I mean, I found where some of the Charlie Barnett stuff was. I knew he had some stuff on Everest, but I found a bunch more on Capitol. I found a bunch more, where else did I find some Barnett stuff? I found a bunch of it. And Barnett stuff's fun. Oh, some Verve stuff even on the 2000 series. But there's quite a bit of Barnett stuff that I've been adding in. And of course, Stan Kenton and Woody Herman, those two big bands kind of dominate the 50s. And so their records are kind of everywhere, and they both have a couple records that are considered classics of the genre of that time. And so you have Ellington, you have Basie, you have, even a guy like Glenn Miller who died during the war has a lot of stuff being issued on LP still. And so I really kind of was expecting to stumble on some Benny Goodman classic stuff from the 50s. I was like, the guy was the biggest figure in jazz, the king of jazz. He wasn't burdened by being a black man. He was, a Jew, but he looked like a white guy in every sense of the word. He was just lauded. King of swing. Huge crowds would show up. Sold a lot of 78s. His career was the apex of jazz in a lot of ways, Goodman. He was an incredible player. And he would seem poised to go into the 50s in some small groups, especially since he engineered those small groups with Krupa, with Lionel Hampton, with Teddy Wilson. It would stand to reason that he would have some great small group stuff from the 50s. And I just figured I must be missing it on RCA or on Capitol or on Columbia and Decca. And no, there's no Goodman stuff there. There's not Goodman stuff on Verve. There's a collection that comes much later in the Creed Taylor era. What you get from Goodman mostly is stuff from the 1938 Carnegie Hall concerts and the small group stuff with Krupa, Hampton, and Teddy Wilson. And that stuff's being issued a lot by Columbia in multiple different covers and formats. It's constantly being put out there and regurgitated. But Columbia's not issuing really new, current Goodman. There's a hi-fi BG record on Capitol that's a fine session it's out there. Must have sold decently. But it's certainly not lauded like Blues in Orbit or the Atomic Mr. Basie. You don't really hear about BG and hi-fi as being a classic must-have record. And so one of the greatest disappearing acts, possibly in music history, is the disappearance of Benny Goodman. And, I'm not saying I have everything. There's got to be gaps, but even when you look at his wiki page, it seems like what's being issued in the 50s and even the 60s is a lot of European concerts, kind of live stuff, back era stuff. I guess there's some stuff coming at Phillips. Maybe that was Woody Herman we were talking about. I know Herman has stuff there too. But, there's just not a lot of Benny Goodman work. Artie Shaw had that Moonglow record in 59, 58. That record sold really well. The only other one that really comes to mind that was really a pretty big star that really disappears in the LP era is Cab Calloway. But Calloway does have a few LPs that there. I don't think anything that's really on the level of Ellington, Basie, and some of the other, Kenton and Herman guys in terms of popularity. But and Cab Calloway, of course, was African American, which limits his potential to sign. And he, like I said, he has stuff on Epic. He has another record on, it was RCA, Heidi Ho Man. And Heidi Ho was a staple, and Blues Brothers. There's just places where Cab Calloway's legend kind of has stayed with us, thankfully, because he was one of the great entertainers, and some pretty great talent played with him over the years as well. including Dizzy Gillespie, if I remember, at a young age. And Cab wasn't much for Dizzy's wildness. His Chinese music, I think he called it, if I remember, which is kind of funny. But what happens to Benny Goodman? And boy, I'm sure there's going to be a Benny Goodman expert out there who's going to correct me on some of this. But I mean, I don't see an album lauded by jazz people by Benny Goodman really post 38. And I'm sure he records well into the 40s during the war. The war band happens. He was known to be a difficult person, but so was Charlie Mingus. And Mingus recorded all over the place. I mean, Mingus is everywhere, including on Columbia, which he wasn't long for that world, I don't think. But Mingus has oodles of recordings. And a lot of it ends up in kind of small labels because he wasn't the most fun person to work with. But Benny Goodman was Elvis. He was so huge. He was the biggest white interpreter of black music, a top-level player. And, Scott Baldwin suggested he didn't want to change and adapt to the modern sounds of jazz. But I wouldn't really say Herman was in the 50s. Kenton was kind of grafting some new stuff. Basie's still swinging the blues. And Ellington's always been Ellington. So it's not like these guys all reinvented themselves. Basie does do some small group stuff, which is fantastic. But Goodman kind of wrote the book on small group stuff from a swing band. Those trios and quartet sessions are just legendary. And I posited the question to Scott yesterday, and he don't think it's the case. But was there a backlash in any way for him breaking the color barrier and bringing in Hampton and bringing in Wilson and then recording with Charlie Christian? I mean, I don't think so. But Christian dies in 41. And he's already left Goodman by that time. And then the recording band comes in pretty soon during the war after that. And the thing is, business executives don't usually make decisions based off of social issues or even how difficult somebody is. They usually base their decisions off money. And it's hard to think of a context where Benny Goodman wouldn't have sold well for Columbia or RCA, especially in a kind of a smaller, stripped down, maybe a mixed group setting. The guy could have, Buddy DeFranco made tons of records. He kind of fills the void that Goodman probably should have been filling on the clarinet in the 50s and the 60s. So what is Goodman up to? And I skimmed through his wiki yesterday. Like I said, I know he was still playing. I know he was still touring. Scott thinks he might have heard before that Goodman recorded them himself a lot and was trying to sell his own tapes. And that eventually, I can't remember who he said got them. Someone ended up with those tapes. Somebody was at college, I think, got them. I think it's what Scott told me. And that would make some sense. But the fact that he couldn't license any of that stuff to any label throughout the 50s, that seems strange to me. And again, you would think that Norman Granz would have jumped at the chance to record Benny Goodman. The guy's stature was so big, it just, there's something I don't know. There's something I'm not understanding here. I don't think he was having health issues that I know of. Maybe he just didn't want to. Maybe he was just satisfied reselling the 38, 39 stuff. I don't know. It's just an interesting enigma, as you will. And if anybody has some insight or thoughts to share or knows what label he recorded a bunch of classic records on in the 50s, I'd be interested to see. I said I do have some Goodman stuff, but it's kind of sparse. Most of it is earlier work, not current work. There's a few pieces I have that I know of that are current things, but it's really sparse for a guy of his stature. And just a strange anomaly that I've never heard anyone discuss it before. And I think once I got all the Decca and Columbia and filling in a lot of the artists whose stuff was on those big labels at that point, a guy like Jonah Jones, filling in his discography, okay, that's where he ended up. Jonah had a great discography. Jonah played with some great bands back in the day. He's the real deal. And so just going through what Capitol and RCA, Decca, and even Columbia was adding to the mix. Buck Clayton had a lot of records at Columbia. So a lot of guys did kind of climb that ladder to those 4 labels. Al Hibbler, who sang with Ellington, and a number of records for Decca. So you're seeing where some of them did get up there. Cootie Williams, who played with Ellington for a while as a trumpeter, has a record on RCA. And it just hit me one day. It's like, and part of it was printing out my my bookbinder Wikipedia discography pages. And I was like, just kind of thinking of guys who I hadn't printed off a list for. Excuse me. And part of the guys I hadn't printed off, some of them was because they were difficult. Gene Krupa. I finally did it, but it's like Krupa's Clef stuff. He's got Verve stuff. A lot of it's been reissued stuff. Columbia stuff. Earlier 78 era stuff. And I did my best to figure it out. Even Tal Farlow's right there in that crossover where he's got Norgran stuff that becomes early Verve stuff. It gets reissued several times with different covers. It takes a while to check off an artist like Tal Farlow. And there's even a Tal Farlow record on Discogs that has listed under its various issues an incorrect one, which I think I saw that before. I'm like, oh, I don't need this record. I have it. But when I did a little deeper look at it, I'm like, oh, that's actually not the same sessions at all, not the same songs even. This is the same as this record. So it's a mistake that somebody put in Discogs that no one caught. This fucking cable. Yeah, I probably should say something to somebody, but I'm always in the middle of something when I'm doing whatever I'm doing. So, yeah, so Benny Goodman, just interesting thought. And hold on one second. So today, I'm going to play some Cannonball Adderley. And I'm a big fan of Cannonball Adderley, one of the great alto players. He kind of gets elevated in popularity with the Kind of Blue record. And, of course, something else on Blue Note, which is really co-piloted by Miles Davis, and in many ways is a Miles Davis session, as most of you well know. But Cannonball has an interesting history. He's a Tampa, Florida native, him and his brother Nat Adderley, who's a cornetist, trumpet player. And Nat Adderley's a fiery player. I love Nat. A lot of spit in that gumbo. Like, he turns it out. He's got some aggression and some tension that he's always releasing. And Nat and Cannonball's Adderley's careers are kind of interwoven, especially in the early years of their career. They come to Savoy quite early and do a couple sessions together, and then they end up at Emercy together, where they do quite a few sessions together and solo as well. And then they both end up at Riverside, where they do a lot of stuff together and separately. And then they finally go their own ways in the early to mid 60s. They kind of go their separate ways. Nat goes to Atlantic, and Adderley ends up at Capitol. Cannonball ends up at Capitol, where he makes a slightly more saccharine but very accessible form of jazz. And I don't have a lot of his Capitol stuff, honestly. It just comes late enough that I never bothered to pick. I have like 3 or 4 of them, but his work at Savoy is kind of what I want to talk about today. And these are 2 pretty hard to find Savoy records. And these are actually Savoy sessions, which, as I've gotten to know Savoy better and better over the years, you find out that a lot of the stuff at Savoy was actually repackaged stuff they had purchased from small labels that folded. And that's not a slight against them. It just diminishes in some way what the Department of Talent Research and development, I thought Savoy was really developing and training a lot of young talent. It's not so much that as it was just they were buying up little labels and issuing that stuff as those names became more popular elsewhere. And I mean, it was probably a decent approach, but one of the great ways you can know if it's a real Savoy session, led by Ozzy Cadena and then Herman Lubinsky. And Lubinsky ended up getting banned from the studios. They wouldn't let him down there a lot because he was just a difficult person, and he was quite bigoted and treated his black musicians like cattle. But wasn't shy with the N-word from all accounts. This is, but one of the great ways to know if you have a Savoy session legitimately is Hank Jones, is Kenny Clark, is Wendell Marshall, the rhythm section. I mean, even if you have 2 of those 3, it's pretty much going to be a Savoy actual recording. And this is probably lead build to Kenny Clark here, the great drummer.
Yep.
But this is a build to Kenny Clark. And It's quite the session in all definitions of it. You look at the band on this: Nat Adderley, Horace Silver, Cannonball Adderley, Donald Byrd, Paul Chambers, and Jerome Richardson. And Richardson is probably the least known of that group, but he's a fantastic multi-instrumentalist, flute, tenor, clarinet. He can do it all. He's such a great sideman. He shows up on hundreds of records in the 50s and 60s, and he's just prolific, and less so as a leader. He's one of those guys. Never really wanted to lead sessions, it seems like. But boy, he's a talent. Plays tenor and flute on this. Then you have, like I said, Byrd, Chambers, Adderlys, Horace Silver, Kenny Clark. That's Blue Note, Riverside level playing and talent. And this is a great early hard bop session from the Cafe Bohemia. It's number 12017. And it would make it one of the earliest Savoy releases that was actually recorded at this time, because a lot of the earlier stuff in the 12,000 sequence is going to be 78 era, 10-inch era stuff being repackaged and issued as an LP. And so this definitely has a genuine article, Savoy recording by Savoy musicians that's current and up to date with what's happening in the scene at this point, which is much less common at Savoy than I realized. Fantastic stuff. And Adderley's one of the real stars on here, along with Cannonball. Along with his brother Nat, I'm sorry. And then Byrd is quite fantastic as well. And then 12017 is immediately followed by 12018. And again, a lot of these have multiple covers. The Bohemia one has 3 different covers. I think this one has at least 2. There's another one with cannonballs on the cover of this, and then color. This is a fantastic, like I said, it's the very next release, and it's got an incredible group on it, including Nat and his brother, obviously Cannonball, Kenny Clark, Paul Chambers, and Hank Jones. Paul Chambers, Hank Jones, Kenny Clark, Nat Adderley, and Cannonball Adderley. Just high level, hard bop, aggressive, freedom finding. This was in tune with what was happening across the river in Manhattan, or even up in New Jersey where Blue Note and Prestige were recording. And of course, Savoy records a lot of their stuff in Hackensack as well with Rudy Van Gelder. I'm not sure if these early recordings were with Van Gelder or not. I'm not positive. I don't think they were. And a lot of times Van Gelder is also coming in to remix something down the road. It doesn't even say notes and supervision, Ozzy Cadena. Rudy Van Gelder is the engineer, so must have been his earliest studio. But that's a great quintet by a great player. And you can just smell the church basement hymnal. God, I love that smell. I just really do. That's my napalm in the morning moment right there. The smell of an old record with the paper being just a hint of mildew, moisture, even though it's been, properly dried, and it's as good a shape as these old records can be in an affordable mode. Because this record can obviously go for big bucks, but it plays wonderfully. And I have the Cannonball cover version as well of this. But I just wanted to talk about Cannonball because I think a lot of times I get so into some of the deeper aspects of the music, I forget to talk about some of the more popular artists. And I am trying to run a channel here. But anyway, Adderley's a great player. Kenny Clark, Paul Chambers, great players. His brother Nat, fantastic. Horace Silver. It's just a real fantastic moment in jazz, 55, 56. What Clifford Brown and Max Roach and Harold Land have innovated. The tempos, the aggression, the melodic, rhythmic pulse. It's harnessing bebop, pulling in the reins a little bit, slowing the tempo a little bit, and finding more shape and more groove and a little bit more danceable. And it's probably one of the last great moments in accessible jazz. Bossa Nova comes in 62 and sweeps the world. And again, that's loosely, it's jazz, but it's different. And I love bossa nova, don't get me wrong. And then, of course, the soul jazz movement was once again popular in black neighborhoods. But it's funny how many white jazz musicians shun it and act like it's unworthy. But that stuff is putting the dancing back in the music. And soul jazz and the rhythm and blues, the jump blues, the soul funk bands that are starting to come on the scene, it's all quite inbred. And what bebop took from the music was its danceability. And hard bop starts to put that back, but it's still not really dance music. And soul jazz really puts it back into that format where the black neighborhoods could shuck and jive. You know what I mean? It was good stuff, and I love a lot of that era. And a lot of that stuff like on Prestige sold pretty well. Jimmy Smith sold pretty well at Blue Note. I don't think Jimmy Smith at Verve sold super well in the black communities. I mean, I'm sure he sold some there, but the Prestige stuff, that stuff really, I think, had a pretty good run. Argo had a lot of great soul jazz going into the 60s. And those labels were the ones that transitioned into that next decade and survived, as I've talked about a year ago. And the labels that didn't adapt to soul jazz kind of all go extinct. I mean, it's not really a fuzzy line. It's fairly clear. If you didn't adapt to the guitar and the organ and what was happening in the black sounds of the music, and you stayed with bebop, post-bop, and even the free and the avant-garde, that was a death knell for record labels. It just was not going to sell, and it drove more people away from the music than it's ever brought in. And I'm not going to go on a tirade about free jazz, but man, I've spoken to so many people who have been turned off this music by that often crap. And some guy was talking about he had bought an Albert Ayler record yesterday in one of the Facebook groups, and he just didn't like it. After 10 minutes, he took it off. And a bunch of people were kind of chastising him. And I applauded him. I'm like, thank you for being honest. These other motherfuckers are bullshit. I mean, a lot of these records are hard to listen to and belong in your life on rough days when you need that cleaning of the palate. But they're not a day-by-day listen. And this guy was like, oh, you should do this. I'm like, no, there's so much jazz he can listen to. He doesn't need to listen to something difficult. So I'm going to leave that there. But I find it so annoying. The pretentiousness of so many of these people. It's just fake. I'm sorry, but it just is. I'm not saying everyone who likes free jazz is fake. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a lot of fakeness out there. A lot of the comments I read, I mean, a lot of it's ridiculous. Just straight ridiculous. And I can say that because I probably would have said a lot of that same ridiculous shit 20 years ago. You know, oh, you need to get this because it's important, blah, blah, blah. No, you don't. You don't have to have music that's that difficult if you don't want to have that difficult music. You don't have to like spicy food. You don't have to like hoppy beer. You don't have to like dry Chardonnay. It's fine to drink a Sauvignon Blanc if that's what you like better. It's the same with fucking music. And these pretentious people who try to make everything else condescending, turn a nose up to it. Oh, Brubeck, oh, that's no good. But then they get mad when you condescend the crap that they're trying to peddle off on us. It's just phony. It's just phony baloney. And you want to be seen. Trust me, we see you. We see you. You know, put your monocle back in, buddy. It's drink what you like. Eat what you like. Don't condescend. I mean, there's so much criticism out there of people who dare to speak up that they don't like something that's difficult. And jazz needs to have ambassadors that say there's so much more to jazz than just this difficult nonsense. There's a reason why this came at the very end. It was the coffin, nail, boom, done. Bury this music. It killed it. You know what I mean? And people who I know and respect and love, like Jean-Michel Riester Beethoven, who knew so many jazz musicians really well, talking about the Count Basies and the Ella Fitzgeralds and the Ray Browns and the Sweets Edisons. Like, he knew all these cats well. And free jazz killed the music, killed the danceability, killed the appeal of it. The audience no longer had fun. And half the audience would leave. And these guys try to keep the music alive in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but the music was changing all around them. Rock and roll was, encroaching. R&B was encroaching. And it is what it is. You know, I mean, it is what it is. But most people I know who really, really respect and love this music know that there's so much more to it than those 12 minutes of difficult shit that everyone thinks is the most important thing. And it's funny how listening to some Art Tatum this morning, there's some angles and some dissonance in there that's wonderful and really kind of has elements of the avant-garde, but it's always resolved and becomes back a melodic thing. And I mean, part of songwriting, part of using the bitter is to balance it with sweet. Part of creating dissonance is to resolve that dissonance. Part of having that tight, angular, uncomfortable feel is to get to a bridge and then a chorus that releases that tension. That's what good songwriting is about. From pop to rhythm and blues to hip hop to jazz, it's a universal thing. And when you just focus on the dissonance and the cacophony, and it's unrealistic to expect most people to want to hang out in that. And those of you who question what I'm saying, if your girlfriend leaves the room every time you put that shit on, it sucks. And it takes a long time as a collector to admit something you bought sucks. Because for the most of us, that's the measuring stick. Oh, I bought this, I paid good money for it, so I love it. And I've said that before. But I mean, that used to be me. I bought it, so therefore I love it. I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. I know it, so it's got to be great. And it takes a little bit of an objectivity and a deeper knowledge and collection before you actually get to a place where you can be really constructive with your own opinion and go, you know what? That is a rare move when I want to play that. I don't think it's hard to do that when you've had 50 records and you've bought a lot of avant-garde free stuff and you were told this is so important and you feel like you have to justify what you spent on it. And Bitches Brew, everyone loves Bitches Brew. I gotta love Bitches Brew. And you spend years trying to say, I love Bitches Brew. And then you realize eventually it's sandpaper on your eardrum. You're like, what the fuck is this shit? And there's days where you want to hear that. But let's keep it to that. Let's recognize that this is stuff for once in a while shit. Once in a while when I'm in the mood shit. That's where it goes. That's where it belongs. It's never supposed to be an everyday I want to live in this shit. John Lennon, when he did his Primal Scream Therapy, some of those records he made, those are interesting pieces that you listen to once or twice. Live piece in Toronto, side 2 with Yoko. I mean, if you can get through that whole side, I challenge you to do it a second time. And if you want cacophony, and if you want dissonance, and you want shrill and shrieking and demonic exorcisms, Yoko Ono fits that bill. You want to out Ascension? Put on side 2 a live piece in Toronto. If you're such a hipster, and then listen to that every day and talk about how much you love it, and you just don't get it. Don't see the difference myself. Anyway, I just had to go there. I get so tired of some of the comments I see on the Facebook groups. People who think they know something, professing to be experts, and having just a small fraction of the knowledge of the people they're often admonishing. I'm just like, where the fuck do you get off, dude? And then this also just my last little vent right here. Drives me nuts when people say this is my favorite or this is the best by an artist or by a label when they have 5% of that artist or 5% of that label. You really got to have a lot of somebody's shit to say definitively that this is their best shit. And if you've only heard 3 of the guy's records and the guy's got 72 albums and you're saying this is his best record, you're speaking out of turn, son. If you're saying this is the best record on this label and you got 4 records on the label, what the fuck do you know? Sit down. And these Facebook groups and this social media gives everyone this platform to talk like they're some expert. And I mean, I feel like the people who really know are far more humble than a lot of people who don't know shit. So take a lot of that shit with a grain of salt. Take what I say with a grain of salt. Again, it's my fucking opinions. But I'm also trying to be honest with people. And I'm here every day backing up what I say with trying to turn people onto this music and having the revelation constantly of people saying, you know what? I wish I knew this was what jazz was about sooner. Because all I ever heard was that other shit. And I hated it. I had this roommate in college who played, I can't remember who it was, but it was so awful. I had to leave every night with my girl. I mean, those stories are pretty common. And they don't recognize that a lot of what they've heard through film over the years is the other coin, the other side of that mattress. And there's a lot of jazz that's wonderful, that does create an atmosphere. But they often come to me and go, what is this? It's kind of jazzy. I'm like, no, this is jazz. This is what jazz is. That other stuff that you perceive to be jazz is just a really strong current of highly intellectual people who want to present themselves as the pinnacle of wokeness, I guess. Anyway, I'm done with that rant. It's been a while since I said it, but it's part of why I don't really look at those. I get frustrated. It's probably why I don't really look at those, a lot of the Facebook stuff anymore. There's just a lot of self-appointed geniuses, a lot of self-appointed experts. And, I mean, you just really need to know more than I've been collecting vinyl for 6 months. And I can tell you what the best pressings are, what the best albums are by each. And sit down. Listen to the music for 10 years before you start talking. I mean, this isn't some 2-year degree. Jazz is a lifetime of learning, of getting it, of grasping and listening and feeling and knowing the history and grafting the American story onto this music. It's hard. It's hard. And the part of what gets me the most is, to me, this music's spiritual. It's important. It's historical. It's the overcoming of a people through a difficult storm, to finding shelter in a wonderful cove of art. And to see how little that part is celebrated by most people, how they just think it's about the virtuosity and the pressing and it's almost, I'm almost indignant because it almost feels sacrilegious at times. You've commercialized the crucifixion and you're selling trinkets on the market and you're trying to make everyone forget what the meaning and the significance actually was. My mom hated how Christmas was no longer about Christ. Well, I hate how jazz music is no longer about feeling a people rising up and celebrating life in spite of their struggle. That's a powerful testimony. That's a powerful message. And if you can spend an hour talking about this music and not address any of that history, that significant spiritual reasoning, you haven't really felt the music yet. And you don't really know enough to be commenting on it. And truth be told, the people I know in this art form who really know it feel the same way. They feel the same way about the artsy new age jazz in the 70s and the 80s. They feel the same way about the free avant-garde stuff that most of it's a small department. They feel the same way about a lot of the posters and the commentary. And that's why some of them have kind of left the social media networks. Because it's just a cool club trying to outdo each other with the coolness instead of recognizing the power. And to collect Bibles for their binding and their collectability, and to not talk about the magic of the spirituality of it and the overcoming nature of these people who went through the wilderness. It borders on sacrilege to me. And I mean, for people who are claiming to be woke, they're sure asleep. Peace.